Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're stepping into, well, the really intricate world of Hinduism as it is today.
That's right. And our sources give us a pretty staggering picture. We're talking over 1.15 billion followers globally.
Yeah, something like 15, maybe 16% of the entire world population. Huge numbers.
Definitely. And while you find Hindus all over, the vast majority are concentrated, of course, in India and Nepal. They're actually the majority there.
Right, and also significant populations, though often as minorities, in places like Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Even the US and UK have large communities.
And Mauritius and Fiji, too, interestingly, with near or significant percentages.
What really jumps out from the source material, though, is the sheer resilience of what it calls Hindu traditions. It's survived, even thrived, despite centuries of external pressures.
It has. And I think a key thing to grasp right away is that Hindu traditions, plural, is deliberate. It's not like, say, a highly structured religion with one central authority.
You mean it's not monolithic?
Exactly. Think of it less like a single, neatly defined tree and more like a vast, sprawling forest. It's all connected, sure, but incredibly diverse within itself. Different ecosystems of belief, practice.
Okay, so that diversity is part of its strength, its resilience.
Absolutely. It allows for adaptation in a way that's maybe different from, say, Buddhism, which, while also huge, maybe 500 million followers, has a somewhat more defined structure historically.
Interesting contrast. So focusing back on Hinduism, while it's global, the main influence is still very much South Asia, India, Nepal.
That's where the heartland is, yes. But it's also important to note, as our sources do, the difficult situations many Hindus face as minorities elsewhere.
Right. You mentioned Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia. There's documented persecution.
Yeah.
And it's not unique to them. The sources also mention similar serious issues facing Buddhist populations in places like China.
A very tough reality for many.
Which kind of brings us to the core question for this deep dive, doesn't it? Given this complex picture, deep roots, global spread, but also regional dominance and minority struggles, what are the key factors hindering, or maybe just complicating, engagement with external ideas in these regions?
That's the central puzzle. And our sources suggest looking first at the political landscape, particularly in India.
Okay. What are we seeing there?
Well, a major theme is the rise of Hindu nationalism. Specifically, an organization called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, or Sangh Parivar.
Ah, yes, the RSS. I've heard of them.
They wield significant influence, according to the sources, across businesses, media, politics, even reportedly the judiciary and the army. They also have an international wing, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad.
So quite pervasive. And what's the ideological thrust?
The sources describe a shift away from what some might call a more soft, tolerant Hinduism towards something more assertive, often termed hard Hindutva.
Hard Hindutva. What does that mean in practice?
It's essentially an ideology that strongly emphasizes a distinct Hindu cultural and national identity for India. You see growing support for slogans like India for Hindus.
And this has political traction.
Very much so. The success of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, is pointed to as evidence. And the sources suggest this has tangible implications for minority groups.
Such as?
Well, things like laws prohibiting cattle slaughter are mentioned, which the source notes tend to impact Muslim communities more heavily. Also, these freedom of religion acts.
Oh, it does do.
They essentially restrict converting away from Hinduism, but interestingly, they often allow or even encourage reconversion back to Hinduism.
Huh. And Nepal is seeing similar trends.
Apparently so, yes. Similar legislative directions are being observed there, too.
So this push seems quite deliberate, establishing India as a Hindu nation.
That certainly seems to be the goal for some groups, yes, which of course contrasts with India's current secular constitution.
Is this a mainstream view, though, or more fringe?
That's a good question. The source suggests that while many Indians might still be comfortable with pluralism, there's a very loud, very influential push from certain quarters. Some predictions mentioned are, well, quite extreme.
Like what?
Like the idea that Christianity and Islam could be essentially wiped out in India by 2030. Now, that's presented as a fringe prediction, but it shows the intensity of some viewpoints.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay. And there was something else mentioned. Sanskritization.
Yes, another political dimension. It's a push to promote Sanskrit and Hindi, often involving changes to education curricula and how history is taught.
Trying to embed a specific cultural narrative.
Precisely. And like the other aspects, it faces its own forms of resistance.
It's not just politics, though, is it? The cultural roots run incredibly deep.
Oh, absolutely. Even with all the modernization, Indian society is profoundly traditional in many ways. That 2014 survey mentioned in the source,
Mm.
it's striking.
The one about arranged marriage?
Yeah, 95% of young people still preferring arranged marriages, specifically within their own caste. That tells you a lot about the enduring power of these social structures.
And the caste system itself. The source calls it a nation within a nation.
A very apt description. It highlights the sheer fragmentation. We're talking about thousands. The Archaeological Survey of India apparently identified 4,635 distinct people groups,
4,600. Wow.
often linked by language, forming their own subcultures. So you can imagine how incredibly difficult cross-cultural engagement becomes, even for Indian missionaries trying to work across these lines.
It's like trying to navigate dozens of different countries within one border.
Pretty much. And then you layer the linguistic diversity on top of that.
Right. 18 major state languages plus countless local ones.
Exactly. Just learning Hindi or Tamil or Bengali might not be enough if you're trying to connect deeply in a specific local community.
It makes you wonder about the mindset of people trying to engage from the outside. The source mentions a potential pitfall.
Yeah, the idea that some might assume Hindus are either uniformly resistant or all deeply philosophical theologians.
Which isn't the case.
Not necessarily. The reality on the ground, the source suggests, is that many people follow various forms of folk religion. They might be quite open to learning, but you need approaches that respect their specific context, not a one-size-fits-all method.
Which leads us naturally into the philosophical side, or maybe the lack of a single side.
Precisely. Defining Hinduism itself is notoriously difficult. There's no single founder like Buddha or Christ, no single universally accepted creed or scripture, no central pope-like figure.
The Indian Supreme Court called it a way of life, right?
Yes, which captures that breadth. Within Hinduism, you find an incredible spectrum. Monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, monism. Even strands of humanism, atheism, and agnosticism can arguably fit under the umbrella.
That must be incredibly challenging for someone coming from, say, a Christian or Islamic background with a more defined theology.
Definitely. How do you even begin to engage when the beliefs can vary so widely? Interestingly, though, the source notes that while many Hindus might follow rituals without a deep intellectual grasp of the underlying philosophy,
They still value them.
yes, and they often enjoy discussing them, the practice itself holds meaning. But this also highlights a potential barrier. If Christianity, for example, is presented in a very Western, perhaps overly intellectualized style,
It might not connect.
it might seem alien, yeah. The source does observe that historically, conversions have been more common among Dalit communities, formerly known as untouchables, and tribal groups, perhaps where existing social structures were less rigidly tied to mainstream Hindu practices.
That makes sense. And overlaying all of this is a deep sense of the spiritual, isn't it?
Immense. Both Hindu and Buddhist communities are described as deeply religious. There's widespread reverence for countless gods, goddesses, spirits at the village level, community level, family level.
You see it in the temples, the home shrines, the festivals.
Absolutely. And the sheer amount of time, energy, and resources poured into pleasing these deities is enormous. Think of something like the Mahakumbh Mela festival.
Millions upon millions of people gathering for ritual bathing. It's staggering.
It really highlights the spiritual intensity. And this leads the source to talk about spiritual strongholds.
What does that mean exactly? Not just disagreement, but something deeper.
Yeah, it suggests that in regions like North India, Nepal, parts of China, including Tibet, the resistance to external religious ideas isn't just intellectual. It's woven into the very fabric of society, belief, and daily ritual in a way that creates very strong spiritual barriers to change.
Okay, so we've painted a picture of immense complexity. Political nationalism, deep cultural divisions, linguistic variety, philosophical breadth, and intense spiritual focus. Given all that, what kind of approaches does the source suggest for effective engagement? It sounds like standard methods might not cut it.
They really might not. The source stresses the need for, first off, culturally appropriate apologetics, developing thoughtful, relevant answers to the questions and objections that Hindus might actually have. Not just Western theological debates, but things like, well, how does this new belief relate to my family, my ancestors? If all paths lead to God, why choose this one? Why was I born Hindu if this other way is true?
Real, practical, life-impacting questions.
Exactly. And providing answers that make sense within their worldview is crucial, both for seekers and for believers who might face hostility. Materials explaining core Christian concepts, for instance, need to be framed differently.
And beyond just answering questions.
Contextualization is huge, moving past potentially outdated Western mission strategies and truly adapting to the local realities.
Easier said than done, I imagine.
Oh, for sure. The source notes there can be resistance to change even when old methods aren't proving very effective, but it emphasizes understanding what local cultures, Hindu and Buddhist, actually value as spiritual.
Like what?
Things like compassion, moral purity, simplicity, humility, sacrifice, generosity. These are admired qualities.
So connect with those values.
Yes. And the encouraging part is, the source believes many people are still open to hearing about different perspectives, if presented respectfully and in a way that resonates culturally.
Which implies needing new kinds of approaches, maybe new kinds of people doing the engaging.
Exactly. The source talks about needing a new breed of missionaries, people willing to think outside the box, to see where God might already be at work in a community, and kind of join in with that.
Not just imposing from outside.
Right. There's this analogy used of a flowing river. You can stand on the bank analyzing it, or you can jump in and trust God's working within the current. It also heavily stresses the role of local missionaries.
Because they inherently understand the culture and language?
Precisely. Their cultural fluency is invaluable. So training and empowering local believers is seen as absolutely key. And part of this is being open to learning from other cultures too, recognizing they might hold elements of truth.
That's a challenging thought for some, maybe.
It can be. But the source uses biblical examples, like from Judges or Moses seeking local advice, to argue for the wisdom in learning from the context you're in.
Okay. What about social issues? Does that play a role?
A massive one. The idea of being salt and light is directly linked to addressing oppression and injustice. Indifference isn't really presented as an option.
So practical action speaks volumes.
Immensely. The source points to figures like William Carey, Mother Teresa. Their work in social justice made the message they carried incredibly attractive and credible. It demonstrated compassion.
That makes sense. The source also mentions people movements. What's that about?
It's looking at the reality of mass migration today, but also historical patterns. Christianity in India, for example, often spread through entire groups or communities deciding to follow Christ together.
Rather than just individual.
Yes. And the idea is to study these movements, maybe support them, because people moving together find better support and resilience. It also touches on respecting the autonomy of new converts in navigating their family and cultural decisions.
Interesting. What about more supernatural aspects, signs and wonders?
Yeah, the source acknowledges a difference here between, say, the typical Western church view and the perspective in much of the global South.
Where miracles are seen as more expected.
Or at least necessary, sometimes. The idea is that for many people, intellectual arguments alone aren't enough. They need a kind of spiritual push, an experience of something beyond the ordinary.
So not dismissing that aspect?
Not at all. And prayer is highlighted as absolutely fundamental. Even people not sympathetic to Christianity might be open to receiving prayer.
As an initial point of contact?
Exactly. It opens a door for spiritual engagement. People need to experience God's power in their lives, maybe through healing, or help with family problems, or protection from things they perceive as negative spiritual forces.
The source mentioned a sequence: power, truth, faith.
Right. Often the desire is first for a power encounter, seeing God's power demonstrated. That can then lead to interest in the truth encounter, understanding the message. And finally, the faith encounter, personal commitment.
So demonstration is key again.
Absolutely. It leads to the idea of demonstrating the gospel holistically, integrating service and action with preaching. Bishop J.W. Pickett is quoted, realizing that bare preaching often wasn't enough.
The gospel needs to be visibly good news for today.
Precisely. Shown through love, forgiveness, practical help, especially for those suffering. People need to see the truth lived out, not just hear it talked about.
You mentioned earlier that conversions were more common among marginalized groups. Does the source elaborate on that?
Yes, it talks about the trickle-up theory. Basically, the historical observation is that focusing outreach solely on the elite often failed.
Why is that?
Perhaps because the elite were more invested in the existing system, but focusing on the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, when their lives were transformed, that impact often spread upwards through society.
So start where the need is greatest.
That seems to be the lesson drawn by figures like Bishop Pickett and Bishop Azariah, according to the source, which also leads to a strategic focus on women and children.
Why them specifically?
as often being particularly vulnerable groups, but also as key influencers of future generations. Reaching women and children can have a profound long-term impact on a community.
And finally, what about resources? Missions cost money.
A crucial point. The source highlights the need for financial support, but also advocates for a shift in thinking, moving away from a simple sending nations versus receiving nations model,
Towards what?
towards mission from everywhere to everywhere, recognizing that resources and initiatives can, and should, increasingly come from within these Hindu and Buddhist majority nations themselves.
Is that realistic?
Well, the source points out that these cultures often have strong traditions of charity and religious giving. The potential for local funding is there. It's about empowering local churches and communities, even the poor, to become self-supporting and contribute to the wider work.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear the landscape of Hinduism today is, well, incredibly complex.
Absolutely. Multifaceted is an understatement. We've touched on significant challenges, political pressures, deep cultural and linguistic divides, a huge philosophical spectrum, powerful spiritual traditions.
But also potential avenues for engagement, right? The need for really nuanced, culturally sensitive, locally driven approaches seems paramount.
Yes, understanding the influence of politics and culture, respecting the internal diversity, and moving beyond simplistic models seems crucial based on our sources.
So to leave our listeners with something to think about, given everything we've discussed, all the deep cultural and spiritual roots, what might be one, perhaps unexpected point of connection, a shared value or common ground that could maybe foster a bit more understanding between these different worldviews?
That's a great question to ponder. What resonates across these deep divides? Worth thinking about.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.